Hey fella. Special delivery. Oh! That stung, man. What the hell was that for?
So your package got lost in transit.
What did I order? Tylenol?
I'ma be honest, man. I was just trying to save you from this.
Oh, thank you for showing mercy.
Oh boy, this one's gonna be fun. We've got dog crap and polished dog crap. Sonic 3D Blast, because when a company is in crisis, the best thing to do is release whatever the hell this is. This game is unique, not only in its actual contents, but its history. So to fully understand why and how, let's head back to 1996. So much was going on. Sonic 3D Blast? Mad cow disease? Sega was in a pretty interesting position. With the Genesis on life support and the Sega Saturn somehow already having flatlined, they were panicking. Long story short, Sega's 32-bit console, the Saturn, was announced to be available at retail with less than a day's notice at E3 1995 for $399. And this gave retailers very little time to prepare, thus making consumers have no clue the console had even released unless they were sweaty Sonic fans.
I wasn't alive in 1995, but you can bet your ass I would have bought 7 of them.
Couple this with the fact that Sony's PlayStation was absolutely dominating the market with its cheaper prices, a direct jab to Sega, it's safe to say Pebble Beach Golf Links wasn't going to cut it. So this console's first year was spent lying at the back ends of Toys R Us's around North America, wondering why nobody loved it. Ask Pebble Beach Golf Links. But even worse, come late 1996, Sega realized, oh hey, Christmas is right around the corner, we need to make money! Enter Sonic Extreme, the little game that would, then wouldn't, then just couldn't. This is one of the most famous game cancellations of all time. Extreme was meant to be the big Sonic game for the platform, the Saturn saver if you will, and on top of that, the Blue Guy's big leap into 3D. Now just a little problem. Put an asterisk next to little. Development was not going along very well, and the conditions for employees were absolutely brutal. A lot of employees were getting very sick, and after a bunch of delays, Sega decided to flat out cancel the game, but don't worry, they had a backup plan. This is just pouring more salt on the wound. Enter Sonic 3D Blast. Now you see, while Extreme had crashed face first into a wall, 3D Blast was coming along quite nicely as a sort of companion title, exclusively for the Genesis. Traveler's Tales had been developing this thing, a very un-3D game, and Sonic's swan song for the Genesis. Was this not good enough?
Alright, this stuff exists.
But of course, it being a swan song wasn't good enough. How would they satisfy the two people who owned a Saturn? Not Pebble Beach Golf Links. And so the decision was made by Sega to put all their resources into taking 3D Blast and porting it over to the Saturn in time for both versions to meet the holiday deadline. Now interestingly, the game was only released on the Saturn in North America and Europe initially, with even Europe waiting until February of 1997 to get the game. Japan didn't get it at all. Now while an official reason wasn't given, it's usually thought that the game remained a Genesis exclusive there because in Japan the Saturn actually sold well, so there was no incentive necessary for consumers to buy one. How is this considered an incentive? It's a goddamn apology! Now they did eventually get the game in 1999. Why did it take so long? Ask Sega.
Sonic 3D Blast, also known as Please Just Piss Out, is undoubtedly the most overlooked Sonic game on the Genesis, because it just doesn't feel right. But hey, on the Saturn, it's probably the most popular Sonic game on that system, just because, like, what are you gonna compare it to? Sonic R? But hey, it's an interesting one. Sonic's big leap into 3D by the heaviest technicality you will ever see in your life.
This thing released a pretty tart reviews. Pretty much everything besides the soundtrack got heavy criticism. The Saturn version was slightly more well received, but I don't think anybody actually played that one. Nobody owned a Saturn. Regardless of its poor reception, the game does hold a bit of a legacy, with Sega usually including it in Sonic game collections and even re-releasing the game on Steam. Now for all intents and purposes, I'll be playing through the Genesis version today, but I will give the Saturn version a try as well. So we start off with this neat little opening animation, and I've got to be honest, the fact that this was meant to be a Genesis exclusive scares the piss out of me. How'd they think this could competently run on a Genesis? And better yet, why'd they try? It's a cool little animation, but on the Genesis it's like trying to microwave ice. It's just dumb. So the plot of Sonic 3D Blast. Robotnik is bored and needs to find a new hobby. Instead of getting into gardening, he thought it'd be funny to capture these things, flickies, because apparently they know the secret to finding the Chaos Emeralds. Of course, Sonic doesn't like this, and so he goes on a fun eyesore-inducing adventure to save the flickies and stop some robots on the way. Now you'd think there's something beyond that, but nope, that's the entire hook of the game, and what you'll spend the entire duration doing. Break enemies, free the flicky, collect them, send them back to their home through a gold ring, repeat. Break enemies, free the flicky, send them back to their home through a gold ring, repeat. Break enemies, free the flicky, send them back to their home through a gold ring, repeat. Jesus Christ! Now before we do get into whining, I'll give the game this. Visually, it's pretty solid. Not counting the final boss and special stages, there are 7 zones here, and they all look pretty distinct. For Sonic zones, they do genuinely feel like actual lived-in environments, with fun colors and shapes everywhere, except they actually make sense. In terms of visuals, I actually really love Green Grove Zone. It's so vibrant and a perfect introduction. Is it the next Green Hill? No, you could give me the answer to the meaning of life and it wouldn't be as good as Green Hill Zone, but visually it definitely sets the tone and is overall just fun to look at, and so are most of the other stages, except for Spring Stadium Zone. Who the hell sneezed their Cheerios over this one? The actual visuals are complemented by how they're presented. For a Genesis game, the 3D sprites are actually modeled quite well, even if this isometric view does make some of it feel unnatural. Besides that, the detail and animation itself is gorgeous. It's quite impressive and just makes me wonder how the hell they couldn't achieve this in the opening animation.
Now everything else, I'm gonna need a Bible.
You see, these levels are pretty to look at, but I don't want to be looking at them for 10 minutes trying to find the last flicky. It gets boring. These levels feel like looping mazes. I'm always so focused on figuring out where to go that I never stop to ask why I'm doing this.
Does it look like I have anything better to do on a Wednesday?
It's really just a lazy fetch quest. Hell, I sometimes forget that Sonic has that whole speed thing going for him. There's so little here that relies on it. It's even worse that for how boring it is, the controls are awful. Sonic feels so slow yet lacks friction. It's hard to make him go anywhere. He never stops when you want him to. Might as well have called the game Sonic. Screw you, John Theophilus Desaguier. You think that's bad? Try lack of friction on an ice stage. That's like stabbing an open wound! Speaking of stabbing open wounds, the perspective doesn't help this at all. I've never been big on isometric 3D games, and while this one isn't the absolute worst, figuring out where you are in relation to everything else is just tough. Like look, here, I'm trying to jump on an enemy. It's just not working. Give it a couple minutes, I'll end up jumping to a better Sonic game.
Not this one!
Really, the best solution here is to just attack the enemies with the spin dash. It's really the only useful power-up in the game. Now, there are a few more items and power-ups to help, like shields and extra lives, and even a new item, the Sonic Blast Attack, which allows you to transform into a missile and just commit the absolute massest of genocides.
One for the whole family!
But honestly, you won't be needing much of those, because for all the enemies you do kill a person over, there's very few of them in every zone. It all feels so empty, like I'm just wandering around these neat-looking zones finding flickies, but I'm never under any pressure to be careful because the worst thing that'll happen is, ooh, maybe a croc will pop out. There's barely any enemies. It just makes the whole thing feel even more tedious. Like it's an obligation. Just get the flickies, throw them through the rings, save the day. Am I missing something?
Ah, integrity.
Like, I guess you can collect rings? That's how screwed this game is. I'm trying to talk positively about a feature that's literally been in Sonic from the very start. That's like saying, oh boy, I sure love this water. It tastes wet! If I had to mention one neat thing, if you do wander around long enough, you end up coming across Tails and Knuckles. Why they're standing here? I don't know, maybe they just got bored one day and decided this was a reasonable solution. If you have 50 rings when you come across either of them, you're transported to these special stages and oh! They're alright. Compared to most of the special stages in previous Sonic games, they're very much on par, but is that really saying much?
No.
This is probably the most 3D the game gets, with Sonic just traversing these paths and making it to the end while collecting rings. They're surprisingly easy and you probably won't find yourself dying very often. In the game, at least. In real life, it's probably already given you a stroke. Like every other game in the series, if you get to the end, you get the Chaos Emerald. Collect them in each stage, you get... Never mind. This game couldn't even afford Super Sonic, instead getting them all just gets you to the final boss. Well, how the hell does this game end if you don't get them all?
Well, let's find out and play through the entire game again. That wasn't satisfying. Sonic 3D Blast is funky, man. I don't have much to say about it.
Of all the Sonic games, this is easily one of the most forgettable. It's so repetitive in its content, and even if it did try to spice things up, it wouldn't matter because the gameplay itself is boring and the controls are atrocious. Sonic can barely run in this game. That's like if you shaved Mario's mustache. Who thought this one through? The only other unique thing I can think of in this stage are the boss fights with Robotnik at the end of every single one. I'm not saying they're good, just unique. Green Grove Zone, it's probably the most understandable zone in the entire game, but it's still very boring and repetitive. There's nothing here beyond an introduction of what to do, which is fine, I guess, but if this is meant to set the stage for the rest of the game, I should have run sooner. Rusty Ruin Zone, everything looks the exact same, which isn't just boring, it makes the whole level confusing as all hell. I just keep backtracking. The zone also really emphasizes how irritating the isometric 3D is. With all these precise jumps you need to make, I could swear I'd made it, only to end up being nowhere near where I was supposed to be. Why? Spring Stadium, you ever played Sonic Spinball? Yeah, it's that. But worse. Diamond Dust, imagine Rusty Ruins but more visually unique. Doesn't mean it's better, I still have no clue where I'm supposed to go. Still, I like some of the ideas here, like the flickies being frozen. It's kinda morbid, but who am I kidding? It's still funny to think about. Volcano Valley Zone, this is level design if I've ever seen it. Visually it pops, I actually really like it. Everything else? Where do I begin? It's just the same thing over and over. Jump over the lava pits, avoid generic hazards. It's just generally difficult too, and with how precise you have to be, the isometric view isn't doing it any favors. Gadget Zone is where I finally realized how much I hate the flickies. The level design here makes it irritating as all hell. You could gather up a bunch of the flickies only to be hit out of nowhere. Then you have to gather them all up again, but in the process of doing so, you get hit! It's an endless cycle of me wondering how life led me and Sonic here. Finally, we have Panic Puppet Zone. This alliteration thing is really starting to get to me. This is the only zone in the game where you don't have to collect flickies, and would you believe me if I told you this is probably my favorite zone for that. The level design is still weird, and I don't like a lot of the gimmicks, but only having one real obligation, that being just getting to the goal, does absolute wonders. Oh, and then there's the final boss. There's even a second final boss if you collect all the Chaos Emeralds, like I said. All the flickies are saved, everybody's happy except me. That was one hell of a game.
Now, as promised, I'm going to take a look at the Saturn version. I won't dig my hands deep with this one, but I will give it a decent look to not piss off any sweaty Sonic fans. Damn it.
So trying the Saturn version out, I've got to say, this is much better. The visuals pop even more thanks to the Saturn's capabilities, and while beyond that there isn't much difference, I kinda dig this version as an upgrade from the Genesis one. Only the visuals though, everything else still sucks. Besides the music, that's also still really cool. The only big difference besides the visuals and music are the special stages, so this is what that 7 weeks of development went towards. They're very similar to Sonic 2, but they're honestly pretty fun, and they're in full 3D. I like this version a lot more than the Genesis one. Now, viewing it on its own, that's a different story. It's neat as an upgrade, but after Sega promised Sonic Extreme for so long, this being Sonic's big leap into the third dimension for Saturn users is painfully underwhelming. Like, oh, you actually put enough effort into buying a Sega Saturn? Well, too bad we didn't put in enough effort to make a good Sonic game for the thing. Play Pebble Beach Golf Links instead. There was also a PC version released in September of 1997. You know, copies of this thing were actually given away in kids' meals at Jack in the Box. You know you've screwed up hard when they're selling your game with chicken nuggets. This is basically just the Saturn version, not much to be said.
That's all I've got.
Sonic 3D Blast is a very interestingly uninteresting game. It just kind of pisses me off because of how much potential it had. Sure, isometric 3D games aren't my thing, but with a lot more polish, this could have turned out alright. The visuals and music are excellent, but it's very hard to enjoy either of them when nothing else here is good. There are these little snippets of enjoyment here and there, but you're immediately thrown back into the loop of poor controls and repetitive gameplay, and then you remember, oh right, this game sucks. If you're interested in playing the game, what the hell is wrong with you? Regardless, I'd recommend the Saturn version or the director's cut released later on. Neither are spectacular, but there's still an improvement on the Genesis version.
So that's Sonic 3D Blast. Not a very good game. Regardless, it has taught me one very important thing, and that's that video games can destroy your depth perception. Watch! Ah, phew. Almost thought that was a good game.